Okay, great. Thanks. Thank you, Martin, and thank you very much for inviting me and for giving me the opportunity to present the PEPPOL BIS Billing 3, also known as the PEPPOL CIUS. PEPPOL conducted a pre-study prior to the development of the CIUS. The pre-study did a gap analysis between the PEPPOL BIS Invoice and Credit Note version 2 and the EN, and also did an assessment of different approaches on how to use the EN within PEPPOL. Based on that pre-study, the recommendation was to create a PEPPOL CIUS, and the work was started in June last year, early June. The working group had members from 12 countries, and we ended the work February this year, publishing optional use end of February 2018. So the aim and the goal of this work was to ensure a high level of interoperability, but we still had a goal to be as close to the EN as we possibly could. And the recommendation in the pre-study was used as guiding principles for the work in creation of the CIUS. So we said that no functions or processes that were available in the EN should be restricted unless there were explicit reasons to do so. One reason might be that a function or a process would give extensive implementation costs. We also needed to ensure that the existing PEPPOL users could continue their current way of invoicing in an EN-compliant way. As the current users of PEPPOL were seen to have a more legal requirement of adopting the norm than a business requirement. So that was one of the issues we discussed on that. One important aspect of PEPPOL is the use of the mandatory BIS and the possibility to exchange invoices without prior bilateral agreements. And some processes in the EN, like self-billing, which is described in Chapter 5.2.13, has a specifically mention in the EN that there's a requirement of a prior agreement between the parties. So that was the guiding principles that we had, and the aim and the goal, as I said, was to ensure a high level of interoperability. That was what we aimed for. So, what did we do? We made changes to the and you could say that you can divide these restrictions into two different types of restrictions. One is that we added rules to ensure correct use according to the EN. In other words, these rules are more or less stated in the EN as textual descriptions, but there are no validations to ensure the correct use of them. One example is shown here where the allowance amount, base amount, is said to be used for calculating the allowance amount together with the allowance percentage. There are no rules, validation rules, to enforce this in the EN or the deliverables from TC 434. So we have added rules to ensure that when you have a base amount, you must have a percentage and vice versa. And when you have them both, the allowance amount must be a correct calculation based on the base amount and the percentage. So that is one kind of restrictions, as it is a business rule that it didn't exist, but it's not a restriction as such. Secondly, we did what I call true restrictions. Some example of this is that we have made some optional elements mandatory. An example of that is electronic address identifier for the seller and the buyer, which is mandatory in the PEPPOL CIUS. Also the process identifier. These are made mandatory because of the use and need for these elements in the PEPPOL transport infrastructure. We also did some restrictions on code lists, where we restricted the allowed codes within an existing code list. An example of that is the restriction we have made for the invoice type code and the credit note type code as such, where we only allow for codes that can be processed as a commerce. If you look at the screenshot, you will see that the fourth column says synonym with, and every invoice type has a synonym with 380, and it's used in the UBL invoice message. This is, we also did the same for the credit note types, and you see here everyone is synonym with 381. So that is a restriction in a code list. We have we allow for less values than what is allowed in the EN. Another example of a restricting code list is the code list for allowance type, where the list that is used in the EN includes several codes which are clearly codes for charges and not for allowances. So to prevent the use of these codes, we allow only a subset of this code list in the PEPPOL base. And all the restrictions we have documented in Appendix A of the PEPPOL base. We have, for restrictions on the data model, we have added a table, as you see examples of here, where you see the business term identifier from the EN and the business term name. And then in the column restriction type, we copy the restriction type, the allowed restrictions as they are specified in the EN in Chapter 732, as Martin also just presented the list of valid restrictions. Then we have added a short description text on what we have done, what is the restriction about, and also the rule, the business rule that we added to enforce this restriction. This is how we have documented any restrictions in the data model itself. But as you saw, we made restrictions on the invoice type codes, and that is actually not just a restriction in a code list, that is restriction in the supported processes. The EN2 has a list of valid or processes where it's stated that it explicitly support these, the EN explicitly support a list of processes. And by removing some of the invoice type codes, we have in PEPPOL also said that we do not support these three processes explicitly. And we have in the Appendix A, Chapter A3, described which processes. These are the three: corrective invoicing, partial and final invoicing, and self-billing. We have listed them with a justification on why we have removed them from the processes we explicitly support. So that were the examples only of the restrictions we have done according to the EN. In addition to that, while working on writing and describing and documenting the CIUS, we found a few or some areas where we thought we should provide a bit more of a help and guidance to the implementers. And we have, this is the main site of the documentation of the PEPPOL. And under the documentation section, you find the BIS, the Business Interoperability Specification. And in the BIS document, we have added several chapters where we aim to provide detailed information on the use of the specification to ensure that the implementers have, or other users have, the information that they need to avoid misunderstandings, ambiguity, and by that prevent non-intended use of elements, because we have a lot of ambiguity that will be a hinder for interoperability as we see it. So I will give you some examples of chapters and sections where at least we in the working group feel that we have provided valuable information for the implementers and users. One specific chapter on calculation, where this is chapter 9 in this document, where if you look at the screenshot to your left, it shows an example of all the calculation formulas for the legal monetary totals. So this is a good help and ensure that the implementers use these formulas when creating solutions or helping their users. We have also added sub-chapters with more specific examples. To your right, you see an example of the calculation of the allowance charge amount. This is then actually the same. In the start, I gave an example of added validation rules that we did according to the text in the EN, and this is an example of where we show this calculation. We have a description and we have a formula as is shown here, and then we have a code snippet with callouts referring to the specific elements in use and how they are used. And this is added for all types of calculation that exist in the BIS. And we have also, one of the restrictions we have made is that we have added calculation rules on line level. And these are also shown and exemplified in the same way as you see for the allowance charge amount. One of the major or significant changes from the mandatory or existing PEPPOL BIS version 2, and the EN is that the EN supports negative grand totals. So, and as we said, we have not removed this functionality or restricted this functionality. So the PEPPOL billing version 3 supports negative grand totals. But as this is a major change, significant change in this for the PEPPOL users, we have provided descriptions in chapter 4.6 on why and which situation you normally would use a negative invoice or can use. And we have given 3 snippet examples. We have the first one that is on the left, which is the base invoice. And this invoice is, the example has 1 allowance charge, and it has 2 invoice lines, one with a positive line amount and one with a negative line amount. And then we show with callouts again the different sections and describe that base invoice. And then in the following 2 subchapters, we give examples of how to correct this invoice if you use a credit, use a negative invoice. So in the middle, you will see how to correct this one if you use a credit note using the credit note schema. Again, we give callouts on how to specify the amounts and specifically the use of negative signs on the amounts. And all the way to the right is the same correction when you use a negative invoice for correcting. Also again, callouts and explicitly stating negative or switch off between the positive and negative signs in these. And these 3 examples are also available as full example XML files. They are located in GitHub, but there is a link to these example files in Appendix E of the PEPPOL BIS. So you can access them either from GitHub directly or from the PEPPOL BIS as such. And as Martin said something about the hampering of interoperability, if we have a lot of different CIUSes. The working group had a lengthy discussion on including what is called national rules. These are rules. We ended up accepting these rules because we wanted to avoid a lot of countries creating national CIUSes, probably based on only 1 or 2 rules that were needed to ensure legal compliance in that country.
Sorry, Siv, sorry to interrupt you.
Yep.
We got a question here about the difference between the credit notes and a negative invoice. I wrote you on the chat function. So what is the difference between a credit note and a negative invoice? Because you stated that PEPPOL didn't want to support invoice cancellation, and it seems negative invoices are cancelled invoices. Is this correct or not?
Invoice cancellation, let's see, I think...
Siv, I think,
yep.
Sorry, Martin also talking here. I think it was the process corrective invoices, which is not the same thing as correcting an invoice in the sense of crediting. No. Or so corrective invoices is another process defined in the standard, which is somewhat different from normal crediting. So traditional crediting of invoices or cancellation of invoices is supported absolutely.
Yes, that was what I was trying to look into. It the cancellation. It was referring to the corrective invoice process, as I mentioned earlier.
Okay, thank you very much.
And just also as an answer, in chapter 4.6, there are descriptions on these examples that I showed here. These are just screenshots of the examples, but there are more explanatory text in the chapter as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Siv.
Yes, back to the national rules. This was allowed and done to, as I said, avoid creation of national CIUSes. The national rules are affected based on the country of the seller or tax representative. There is the definition of a seller in this sense is not just a seller country code. And the rules will not affect invoices issued in other countries. And the rules are created and maintained by the PEPPOL authority of the given country. And this they are responsible for the development and testing of these rules. The national rules are documented in Appendix C, as you see a screenshot of an example with a bit of an explanation of what is a national rule, and also a table with the national rules, the rule ID, if it's a fatal warning, and the text and the technical syntax, schematron, context and test. And of course, these are also available in GitHub as in the schematron rules. So the technical artifacts are, of course, delivered as well. Then we have in chapter 14 described how the validation should be performed for a compliant instance document. These are the validation of a PEPPOL BIS instance should be done in different stages. First, we have in the two first stages, we have the syntax validation, which is performed by the basic XML, checking the well-formedness, and then validation against the XML schema. And then the next stage is to validate against the TC434 rules, both the business rules and the syntax-specific rules, to ensure that the instance is compliant to the EN. And the last is then validation against the PEPPOL-specific rules, both the general rules, which apply to all the instance documents. For instance, that we have a mandatory, the process identifier must be, the business process identifier must be present. That is an example of a rule for the invoices. And then the country qualified or national rules, if they exist for the given country of the issuer. So that are some examples from the BIS document with both how we have documented the restrictions and how we documented and given examples to help the implementers and users of these specifications. We also in the documentation section with the syntax, which is highlighted here. This is the detailed syntax mapping, both for the UBL invoice and for the UBL credit note. So there are two different syntax mappings. The first page you enter into is an overview of all elements in the invoice when you choose that one. And you will see to the left the cardinality of the element. And this is the cardinality as it is enforced by the base. This is not the cardinality of the schema itself. This is the restricted cardinality as we use it in the PEPPOL BIS. And then you have the element name as an hyperlink. And to the right, you have the business term name in bold. And that is the business term name as fetched from the EN data model. A short description and of the usage of the element, and also example values, fixed values, etc. Are shown here as an overview. So if you click on one of the hyperlinked element names, you are directed into the details of that element. This page is divided into 5 sections. First, on top, we have a path to the element you have chosen or entered into. And as you see, this path is every part of the path is a hyperlink. So by this, you can easily navigate to a parent or ancestor element if needed. For instance, here, if you want to look into the accounting supplier part, you just click on that and you will be redirected into the details of that element. In the second part, you have the element name and description. Also, this is the same as shown in the overview page. The third section is a more technical, so you have the namespace element, the data type, and this data type is not the XML data type, it's the semantic data type according to the EN. So we reuse the semantic data types from the EN, and they are specified here. An example value or fixed value will be shown, and the business term identifier as used in the EN, or copied from the EN. And if this element we're using a code list, there would be a heading in this section saying code list and the name of the code list as well. In the fourth section, you will see either attributes, if the element has one, or if this element had any child elements, they will be specified in this section. So here you can see that you will, for the attribute, if this is an optional or required attribute, the name as a hyperlink, so you can link into the attribute and get more details. And a description example is shown as well. And at the final section shows any rules which apply to this element. And you see that so this will show both rules from the EN, as is shown here. This is a EN rule, and also any PEPPOL specific rules. And you see that the identifier of the rule is a hyperlink, and by clicking on that, you will see details of that, giving you the rule identifier, the message, and in the second part, you have the technical details from the schematron. These are extracted from the schematron files, which is the rule context and the test that is performed. And in the final section, you see usage, called usage. You will see any other elements that uses this same rule. And as you might notice, the path is built up the same way as the path in the detailed section here at the top. So every part of this path is also a hyperlink, so you can easily navigate to other elements or parents, ancestors, if you want to. So that is a short presentation of the PEPPOL CIUS. And these are links to the documentation site and also to the GitHub source files. So these are available if you want to use them. And we hope that the restrictions we have made, along with the extended documentation, will be helpful, not hampering it, and that it's seen as helpful for implementers and others. And we hope that a lot of communities see the possibilities in using the PEPPOL CIUS, preventing development of even more CIUSes as such. And if you have any comments or details, I'm also available via email or anything else as such.